You're tuning into something different, something deeper. Welcome to a space where the unseen becomes seen, where the patterns beneath reality are decoded. This isn't just a podcast, it's a journey into the mechanics of belief, perception, and the multidimensional truths shaping our world. If you've ever felt like an outsider looking in, questioning the systems you're told to follow, you're in the right place. This is the Outkast, the Pattern Podcast. Let's dive in.
Have you ever felt that that really unsettling internal just clash with your actions, or maybe even with other beliefs you hold really strongly?
That's cognitive dissonance, right?
That's it. And it's a powerful force. Today, we're taking a deep dive into how this internal friction isn't just, a personal challenge we all face sometimes.
Right.
Our sources show how it can subtly morph into something, much bigger.
Like fracturing within groups?
Yeah, and even what the sources call pseudo-political energies. Things cleverly disguised as, say, self-help movements or personal growth, maybe even collective liberation.
And that's exactly our mission in this deep dive, isn't it? To show how these patterns emerge.
Right.
And crucially, how they can end up creating new forms of adherence or even internal conflict, all while promising freedom.
Yeah, that's the twist.
So we're going to unpack some specific, really fascinating examples from the sources you shared that reveal these contradictions.
And then look at ways to maybe break the spell, as they put it.
Exactly. It's particularly insightful how these sources offer a critical lens on ideas that, at first glance might seem purely about individual liberation.
But they can have much more complex, maybe even troubling implications.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our sources start by introducing us to some intriguing concepts. They're almost like analytical blueprints for certain modern thought patterns.
Frameworks, maybe.
Yeah, frameworks. We talk about what they term atheistic Gnostic and communistic Gnostic frameworks.
And it's important, I think, to understand these aren't literal beings or anything.
No, definitely not. They're presented more as like powerful ideological patterns, ways of thinking that help explain how these dissonances can pop up and play out in groups.
Got it.
So let's start with the atheistic Gnostic. The source describes this as an ideological pattern, maybe a mindset,
Okay.
that preaches a kind of radical self-abnegation, even self-hatred, really.
Wow. Okay. So going beyond just humility.
Way beyond. It apparently requires total self-surrender to the idea that there's no self-love. It actually equates self-love with self-loathing or self-hatred.
That sounds intense.
It does. And from this perspective, the very notion of wholeness is a trap.
Wholeness is a trap.
Yeah, it suggests that, true liberation comes from dismantling your individual identity, discarding any sense of personal worth. It's driven by an energy, the source says, that seeks to remove its own boundaries.
And how does this connect to wider ideas?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The source connects these ideas to established societal theories. Maybe you could shed some light on the Marxism connection they mentioned.
Sure. So just briefly, Marxism, from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, it's a social, political, economic theory. It basically analyzes society through class struggle.
Right. Capitalism revolution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Focusing on capitalism's contradictions and the potential for a communist revolution, it really emphasizes how material conditions shape human actions and society.
Okay, that helps frame it. So
Right.
How does the atheistic Gnostic pattern fit in, according to the source?
Well, according to the source, this atheistic Gnostic framework kind of builds its own narrative by claiming to implement Marxism and socialism as the solutions.
Okay.
But paradoxically, it then stumbles over what the source calls a Gnosticism paradigm, where there's no way out.
No way out. So it becomes...
Total and utter anarchistic in its relevance is the phrase used.
Hmm?
And the source notes there's a lot of stolen information from literally everywhere used to construct this particular narrative.
So it's kind of cobbled together.
Seems that way. Essentially, this mindset is seen as a product of its own self-destruction, one that plays on victimhood and feeds on others' wounds.
Even wounds it might have caused itself.
Potentially, yes. It sounds incredibly insidious, as you said earlier.
It really does.
And importantly, the source also makes a distinction that's relevant here between Marxism and communism. Generally, Marxism advocates for public ownership of the means of production. Communism, as a broader ideal, often envisions collective ownership, no private property, aiming for a classless society. It's a subtle but sometimes important difference in these discussions.
Right. So with that distinction in mind, how does the other pattern, the communistic Gnostic, look?
Well, according to the source, this pattern would see things like self-love, personal wholeness, or even individual well-being as a kind of threat to its own material struggle.
A threat? Why?
Because it sees the societal system as a trap, which many critical viewpoints do, that's fair. But then, ironically, it ends up perpetuating that very system through its own contradictions by perceiving self-love and wholeness as cages or suffering. These become themes it then uses for its own projection, maybe even control.
Projection. Like accusing others of what it embodies.
Exactly. And the sources explicitly call these markings of a cult in its forming.
Whoa, okay. Not necessarily a literal cult with robes and chanting, but
ideological patterns that, by systematically undermining individual well-being, can exert a powerful, almost cult-like influence on a group, devaluing the individual in the name of the collective, perhaps.
that's a really powerful insight, how that pursuit of, collective freedom or even personal freedom can flip into a new kind of trap by just dismissing the individual.
Right.
So with that framework in mind, let's pivot to where these subtle ideological patterns actually show up, often disguised, like we said, in what looks like progressive thinking or even self-help wisdom.
This is where the cognitive dissonance really comes alive, isn't it?
Absolutely. Where you see those internal frictions creating cracks, both in people and in groups.
Okay, let's get into the examples.
First up, the sources highlight one I think many might recognize, the perpetual loner.
Yeah.
Freed from the parasitic system.
Yes, the radical individualist.
Exactly. This person champions radical autonomy. They might see traditional community, society, as inherently corrupt, maybe parasitic.
Believing true freedom is only found in absolute independence, maybe even isolation.
Right, but where's the dissonance there?
Well, here's where it kicks in. You see this person maybe pushing people away, exalting their autonomy, only to then get, kind of prickly or hurt when others actually recoil from them or when they feel misunderstood.
I see. The reaction doesn't match the stated ideal.
Precisely. They claim total self-sufficiency, but their pride is clearly wounded when nobody seems to get their unique path or validate their choices. It's the paradox of seeking liberation through isolation, but still needing some kind of external validation or understanding.
So if true freedom is the goal, what's the critique here? How does this approach fall short?
Well, the critique is pretty powerful, actually. It suggests that true freedom isn't really about being completely alone.
It's more nuanced.
Exactly. It's maybe the courage to stand independently when needed, and the humility to recognize when connection or support is actually beneficial or even necessary.
So rejecting community entirely isn't the answer.
According to this critique, no. If you reject community wholesale, you're not necessarily liberated. You might just be trading society's rules for a new, self-imposed prison, your own fortress of solitude.
Like building the walls so high you lock yourself in.
Spot on. You build the most impenetrable castle, only to realize you're the only one inside, cut off by your own design. The dissonance exposes that, human flourishing often needs a balance between autonomy and connection, not just one at the expense of the other.
That's a great analogy, that drive for autonomy becoming its own kind of confinement. It actually makes me think of the next example from our sources.
Which one's that?
The masses limit infinity.
Okay. This one's fascinating, too. It touches on that idea of boundless thought, right?
Yeah, but with a twist. It seems to expose another layer of contradiction in ideologies that really champion free thinking.
Indeed. The dissonance here is pretty stark, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. You want boundless thought, you see the masses, however you define that, as narrow-minded, maybe unawakened.
Right, limited.
But then, paradoxically, you demand everyone else think exactly as you do.
Or else they're dismissed as, drones? Sheeple? Asleep?
Exactly. You champion a free-ranging mind, but apparently only if it lands on your conclusions.
And the sources point out that real infinity, if we can use that word for thought, isn't some kind of private club with a secret password, is it?
Doesn't sound like it should be.
No. If your rebellion against conventional thinking ends up just silencing any dissent within your new group, you haven't actually opened up infinite possibilities. You've just invented a new orthodoxy, maybe one that's just as rigid, if not more so.
So true openness means engaging with things you don't like.
That's the argument. True openness thrives on engaging with ideas you find challenging, maybe even ideas you hate, as well as the ones you love. It's about the expansion of thought itself, not just validating a specific set of thoughts.
And that kind of cognitive dissonance, that insistence on your open view being the only right one,
Yeah.
that can lead to real fracturing within groups, right?
Absolutely. You see, seemingly open-minded communities become intensely insular, really intolerant of any deviation from their newly established truths. It's a common pattern.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? The sources bring up another common paradox.
Let me guess. Something about inner work.
You got it. Dark night of the soul versus society needs a shaman and an ayahuasca ceremony.
Ah, yes. The tension between rugged individualism and spirituality and seeking external guides.
Exactly. The underlying sentiment is often this praise for brutal, self-confronting inner work. The kind, nobody can teach you because it's so deeply personal, so
The
arduous.
hero's journey, undertaken alone.
Right. But the dissonance becomes clear when that same individual or that same group then turns around and looks to guided rituals, maybe expensive retreats or specific authority figures, a shaman, a guru, whoever.
To deliver the ultimate breakthrough, the salvation.
Yeah. It's like saying this deep work is mine alone and then immediately asking, okay, who can give me the map or the potion? Seeking an external shortcut for an internal journey.
It's less about finding a spiritual shortcut, maybe, and more about just putting in the work. Day after day, like you said, doing the reps at the psychological gym.
Without necessarily needing that magic elixir.
Precisely. And the critique from the sources here is pretty sharp.
How so?
It says, basically, if your salvation or your awakening hinges entirely on a shaman's brew or a guru's stamp of approval,
You haven't really escaped anything.
you haven't truly escaped the system of outsourced authority. You've just outsourced your awakening to a new system, maybe a more exotic-looking one, but still external.
All right.
Authentic transformation, the kind that really breaks the spell of old patterns, comes when you do the heavy lifting day in, day out, with or without the mystical elixirs.
That really highlights how some self-help movements, while they promise deep inner work, can inadvertently create a new kind of dependency.
Exactly. Contributing to those pseudo-political energies we mentioned, where external control gets disguised as personal liberation.
That outsourcing of awakening. It's a really powerful point, and it leads nicely into the next contradiction the sources flag.
Okay, what's next?
Religion puts the cult in culture, versus Jung said religions shield us from spiritual experiences.
Ah, the anti-organized religion stance that then adopts new gurus.
Spot on. You see individuals or groups maybe sneering at organized faith, its dogmas.
And sometimes rightfully so, identifying how rigid structures can limit individual spiritual experience.
Fair point. But the dissonance kicks in when they then turn around and basically canonize new authorities.
Like Jung, or Krishnamurti, or maybe every YouTube mystic who happens to echo their own suspicions.
Exactly. They vehemently reject dogma in one form, maybe the traditional religious form, only to adopt it in another, perhaps less obvious form. They might claim to be total free thinkers.
But their intellectual freedom is suddenly bounded by the pronouncements of their chosen new thought leaders.
Precisely. Whose words become the new, maybe unspoken, but still unquestionable truth.
So it's like rejecting one set of rules only to blindly follow another.
That's it. The critique is basically that rejecting dogma only to worship new authorities is like trading one pair of handcuffs for another. Maybe shinier ones, but still handcuffs.
Right. Because true wisdom doesn't live only in credentials or subscriber counts, or even in the brilliant insights of respected thinkers like Jung.
Where does it live then?
Ultimately, the source suggests it lives in your own lived, unmediated encounter with reality. And importantly, your capacity for critical discernment. Thinking for yourself, basically.
And this particular dissonance, this swapping of authorities, it really exposes the fracturing that can happen, right? In their excitement to break free from old systems.
Simply end up creating new ones with
Yeah.
maybe equally rigid intellectual boundaries. Yeah, that's a key point.
Okay, and finally, there's one more example. This one feels very current, maybe a bit uncomfortable, especially in the modern wellness or spirituality space.
Let me guess. Money's involved.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
Self-awareness is real spirituality versus truth can't be packaged and sold.
Ah, the commercialization paradox.
Exactly. It speaks directly to the business side of deeply personal paths.
It absolutely does. The dissonance here is pretty blatant, isn't it? You insist spirituality is fundamentally inner, it's free, it's an uncommodified experience.
Something that transcends material gain.
Right. Yet, you then turn around and enthusiastically champion paid retreats, high-ticket coaching, subscription apps, online courses, maybe even high-vibe merchandise.
As the definitive path forward, or at least a necessary part of it.
Exactly. You might verbally decry consumerism, but your spiritual practice itself becomes a consumer product.
So the message is don't buy the lie, but then there's that glowing Patreon link or the Shop Now button right underneath.
Precisely that. And the critique here is pretty unflinching.
I bet.
It says, essentially, when your core message is don't buy the lie, but your own authenticity or purity seems to depend on profiting from the very things you claim are being falsely sold.
You've blurred a line.
You've definitely blurred the line between genuine insight and, well, clever marketing, if your spirituality's purity is somehow tied to commercial success.
You're potentially peddling the very hypocrisy you condemn.
That's the charge, yes. And this is just a prime example of how those pseudo-political energies masked as self-help can effectively monetize spiritual seeking.
And in doing so, maybe inadvertently create new forms of dependence, new anxieties.
And further fracture the very ideals of freedom or authenticity they claim to uphold. It's a complex loop.
Wow. Okay. So looking at all these examples together.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, yeah, you can really see how these specific dissonances illustrate that phenomenon we talked about at the start.
Those pseudo-political energies masked as self-help.
Exactly. They promise freedom, radical autonomy, boundless thought, deep spiritual awakening.
But the reality can be different.
Often, yeah. They can lead to new forms of adherence, new dogmas, new internal conflicts, new ways of fracturing groups, which naturally raises a really important question for all of us.
How do we navigate this?
Right. How do we, as discerning learners, engage with complex ideas without just falling into new traps of cognitive dissonance ourselves?
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Someone who's genuinely seeking knowledge, seeking clarity, in a world just overflowing with information where, let's face it, many of these subtle contradictions exist all around us.
Well, the danger, as our sources really highlight, is in those unaddressed tensions, isn't it?
Those but I also moments.
Exactly. Those moments of internal friction that, if ignored, can subtly steer us into contradictions, creating that fracturing within ourselves and maybe within the groups or communities we engage with.
But it's not hopeless. The sources offer some way through.
They do. They offer a pretty powerful four-step process for breaking the spell of dissonance, as they call it, for navigating these complexities with maybe a bit more clarity.
Okay, let's hear it. What's the first step?
First, simply name the tension. When you feel that itch, that mental discomfort, that subtle contradiction, acknowledge it.
Don't just brush it off or rationalize it away.
Exactly, just notice it. Second, lean into nuance. Real growth, real understanding, it happens in the gray areas, doesn't it?
Not usually in the extremes.
Right. Not by just cherry-picking extremes or demanding black and white simplistic answers. True understanding really embraces complexity.
Okay, that makes sense. Name it. Lean into nuance. What's next? These next two feel like they might be particularly challenging, but probably essential for genuine growth.
They are, but crucial. Third, own your shadow.
Meaning,
recognize when you might be recreating the very system you're trying to critique, or when you might be unconsciously embodying the very traits you criticize in others.
that requires some serious self-honesty.
Radical self-honesty, absolutely. And that leads to the final step. Practice radical honesty with your motivation. Is my pursuit of these anti-system ideas or my embrace of this particular self-help philosophy, is it truly empowering real change? Is it fostering genuine well-being, mine and others? Or is it primarily enriching my ego, making me feel special or superior? Or, as the sources might suggest, am I inadvertently supporting a new form of control, just packaged differently?
Wow. These ideas, they really aren't just about spotting inconsistencies in other people or other groups, are they?
Not at all. They're a profound mirror, really.
Asking us to look inward, to really examine the narratives we adopt, the movements we get involved in.
And to recognize our own susceptibility to these internal frictions, to cognitive dissonance. We all have it.
Right.
So maybe something for you, our listener, to mull over or explore on your own.
Okay.
If, as these sources suggest, some of these patterns of thinking, some of these dissonant ideologies really do have the markings of a cult in its forming, how can a deeper awareness of cognitive dissonance, understanding how it works, and recognizing our own susceptibility to it, how can that awareness become perhaps our strongest shield?
A shield against what?
Against inadvertently trading one system, one set of confining beliefs, for another one that might even be more insidious, precisely because it claims to be about freedom.